So now we're moving on to Benjamin Redman from the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. Exchange host is the Centre for Excellence in Music Performance Education in Norway. Benjamin, when you're ready, you can start.
Thank you very much for your patience there. Unfortunately, I'm now doing this blind without my notes, but never mind, we'll crack on. So my name's Ben, and I was very fortunate to get the opportunity to travel to Oslo and to Tromsø in Norway as part of my research trip. So my background is as a musician. Played with organisations and ensembles such as the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra. I've done recordings, played in trad and folk music groups at Celtic Connections and things like that. I gave up the life of a professional musician to move into instrumental music teaching most recently in the Scottish borders, as you can see here. It's a very geographically spread out region. It's also very rural. So, for example, from Peebles in the northwest to Eyemouth in the northeast, it's about 60 miles. So that presents problems for students who aren't able to travel to the main centres, such as in Edinburgh or Glasgow, to play with sort of musicians above their level in, say, the borders. So you may be aware there's the Junior Conservatoire, the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. That's a major investment of time and expense for students to travel, say, from Eyemouth or from Hawick. So I'm very interested in how could we make connectivity and accessibility more available to students. So that led me to my doctoral research at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. This was me just graduating yesterday, finally. And my research was into the use of low latency technologies. Low latency technologies allow musicians to connect together across distances up to 1,000 kilometers as though they're in the same room. That 1,000 kilometers is quite important. We'll come back to that. So the rationale for online lessons, we now all really understand this since the pandemic. Pre-pandemic, it was a bit of a taboo subject, to be perfectly honest. A lot of musicians and music teachers, colleagues didn't like it. They were like, what are you doing? This is going to put us all out of a job. And another common complaint was, but you can't teach music remotely. I've been using online lessons for myself as a student very successfully since probably 2010. Rather than me going to, say, America to study, I can get lessons with musicians in America from the comfort of my own home. So for me, it's a bit of a no-brainer. But anyway, as a music teacher, I regularly would play together with students in lessons, but just because I did it doesn't necessarily mean that every other teacher did it. So I was interested as part of my research to find out, so what do other teachers do in their lessons? And indeed, I found out that through observing 25 lessons, which is actually quite a small sample, but the most frequently used intervention after the student demonstrating what they'd been working on to their teacher was actually the teacher and the pupil playing together. So this was across different instrument categories. Again, it was a small sample, difficult to make a sweeping generalization. However, it was quite telling. What it showed was that what was really missing from online lessons was the ability to play together. So that's where Lola comes in. Lola is short for low latency. The Lola system itself is actually, it's just free software. It's not available to anybody. It's only available to educational institutions. So whereas the software is free, the hardware that is required to operate it is not free. In fact, it's actually quite expensive to buy the specific, it's got to be an expressly defined PC setup, and it requires a low latency camera and a lot of peripherals, and it's generally a bit of a faff. In addition to the expense of the equipment, it also needs a network engineer. There's an IT expert here in this particular shot. This was me playing vibraphone from Glasgow with a saxophonist in Edinburgh. And despite it taking us quite a long time to get everything up and running, we did get it to work, and it worked fantastically well once we were going with it. We also did some teaching trials with other teachers. This is our professor of guitar and harp at the Conservatoire, working with students at Edinburgh Napier. Again, worked really, really well, and it just showed that to access other teachers, you don't need to travel, which is, I think, really exciting. So other opportunities that are new art forms become possible. So this is a slide from a presentation and in fact a performance at the Royal Danish Academy of Music in Copenhagen from 2017, where there were musicians and dancers live in the studio in Copenhagen, but there are also additional musicians based in London at the Royal College of Music and dancers based in Barcelona. And so it was all projected in on screens, and it was just mind-blowing to be there. So these technologies do open up a lot more possibilities. As part of my PhD project, in fact, a fairly major part of it was to conduct a qualitative study with conservatoires in Austria, Italy, and Slovenia as part of the Swing project to find out how the students, teachers, and technicians reacted to using Lola. And overall, very, very favourable. However, there are barriers to using Lola. I've already mentioned the expense, and we need technologists to help, particularly with getting around the institutional firewalls. This is a major, major problem, and it requires a large or high capacity broadband connection. So it doesn't work from users' homes yet anyway. And so when the pandemic came and there was, as we all know, the massive pivot to online learning and teaching, Lola wasn't actually much use because it required the institution to be open in order to use it. So in theory, it should have made things easier, but it actually wasn't much use. Now, the Lola developers didn't do very much during this period. However, latterly, I've also been working with another low latency technology called Jacktrip. And unlike the Lola developers, the Jacktrip developers did make massive improvements in the technology in just a few short months. Jacktrip is not the same as Lola. It's not equivalent because it's audio only. So this presents problems for musicians in that you can't see what the other person's doing, obviously. Now, the most important thing clearly is going to be the audio element, but that was a bit of a problem. However, moving on, a major advantage of Jacktrip over Lola is that it will run on cheap devices such as the Raspberry Pi. Here's one here. It's a very small, cheap device, about £60 or something like that, compared to about £4,000 for the PC that is needed to run Lola. The developers of Jacktrip also brought out a couple of devices which are based on the Raspberry Pi. It's what they called their Jacktrip bridges. There were two versions, the audio and the digital. I won't go into the technical differences, but one of the parts of my research for my PhD was speaking to developers and practitioners and teachers, and it was it was acknowledged that Jacktrip is the high quality option but difficult to use. So just a quick summing up of where we're at. There's a need for low latency technologies to allow musicians to play together in real time. This was really borne out by the pandemic. Lola allows that, as does Jacktrip, but Lola requires an institution. Jacktrip, you can actually connect from home, and also it has the added benefit that you can connect multiple people. So for orchestras and choirs, it's ideal if you can get it to work. So the next part of my research was to go to CEMPE, the Centre for Excellence in Music Performance Education in Oslo, and work with the teachers there. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, again, the lockdown that happened just before Christmas last year, it meant that I couldn't get into the Conservatoire to use Lola. But what I did meantime was to do some training with NowNet Arts in the use of jack trip. That led on to a couple of collaborations, one with a disabled musician in New Zealand and another musician in America. Interestingly, when we tried to connect using jack trip with the musician in New Zealand, despite the distance, we got it to work every time. Conversely, when I was trying to connect using jack trip with my former supervisor back home in Scotland, we couldn't get it to work despite all our technical knowledge. The technology is not reliable. I also travelled to the Arctic University of Norway up in Tromsø, in the north of Norway, and that was a very useful trip, which I'll come on to. I did visit, as I already said, the Norwegian Academy of Music. I also had a bit of sightseeing with Liz Robson, who you've heard from earlier in Oslo. Thanks for showing me around Oslo, Liz. And we're going to look at I flew up to Tromsø. The distance between Glasgow and Oslo is actually less than the distance between Oslo and Tromsø, which is over 1,000 kilometers, which is important because at those distances, it becomes less like playing in the same room. I observed a teaching trial using 2 students in Tromsø and 2 students in Oslo, and just the headlines are it actually worked very, very well. Just whiz through these. The particularly interesting thing was that the team up in Tromsø had a graphical user interface, which it's in the sort of top left corner there, which actually made it so much easier to connect using jack trip. And this is a technology I'm going to be working with quite soon. So outputs, there'll be a report on the jack trip trial, presentation accepted at the NowNet Arts Conference later this year, publications in the proceedings. I'll be working with the teams from Oslo and Tromsø on a research paper, ongoing collaborations between the departments. One thing I didn't mention was the European jazz workshops, which were all part of this project. Ongoing collaborations with the research team in Tromsø, specifically on how to use jack trip, and we're all hoping to collaborate on a major European funding bid. So finally, thank you to everybody at CEMPE and for the opportunity to travel to Norway and be part of this. And I'm really excited to where the collaborations are going to lead to next. So thank you all very much.